Commitment Phobia and the New Architecture of Romantic Choice, presented by Joanna Mica from BASS 2-1. Freedom has been the quintessential trademark of modernity, the rallying cry of oppressed groups, the glory of democracies, the pride of capitalist economic markets, and the reef-roof to authoritative regimes. It has been and remains the great accomplishment of modern political institutions. Ang konsepto ng kalayaan ay masyadong malawak dahil mayroon itong iba't ibang kahulugan at iba't ibang epekto sa iba't ibang konteksto ng institusyon. The freedom of the capitalist market contains such meanings as self-interest and fair competition. Freedom in the realm of interpersonal relations rests on expressive individualism. In the consumer sphere, it resides in the right to choose, and the freedom postulated by civil rights rests on a concept of dignity that is ignored by the other spheres. Ang pagsasagawa ng kalayaan ay tinatag sa iba't ibang kalarangan na may iba't ibang praktikal at moral na kahihinatnan. Thus, although sexual freedom historically is articulated as a political right, freedom in the political and sexual realms differs. Ang political freedom ay pinapagana ng malaki at sopistikadong patakaran ng pamahalaan, samantalang sa interpersonal at sexual na ugnayan, ang kalayaan ay hindi nililimitahan ng sistema ng pamahalaan o mga institusyon, except for the legal constraints of consent. Halimbawa ay ang age of consent, sexual act out of consent, filtration out of consent, at iba pa. In the realm of sexual relations, the most obvious expressions of freedom are exemplified in the changes in the meaning of marriage and of sexuality. In the early 20th century, for most, marriage was a lifetime commitment. Ngunit ayon sa mga pag-aaral sa bansang US, ay habang patuloy na lumilipas ang panahon ay patuloy rin namang tumataas ang kaso ng divorce. Sinasabi rin sa pag-aaral na simula noong taong 1960 ay nagbago ang bawat saloobin patungkol sa divorce. In 1981, Daniel reported an important change in the normative fabric of marriage and heterosexual relationships. Mga taong 1950s ay nagtanong siya sa isang dalaga at isang babaeng may asawa kung bakit nila pinahahalagahan ang kasal at pamilya. Ang kanilang mga tugon ay sumasalamin sa isang malalim na paniniwala na ang pag-aasawa ay parehong kinakailangan at dahil hindi maiiwasan na bagay na nagbibigay ng pagiging kasapi sa lipunan at ito ay isang normal na gawain. Makalipas ang 25 taon, ay nagbago ang saloobin patungkol dito. Ang kasal ay opsyon na lamang para sa mga kabataang babae. Unmarried cohabitation had increased and led to marriage in only 50% or less cases. Since the end of 1970s, marriage and unstable relationships have become optional and are often achieved only after exhaustive search, counseling, and expense. These changes were the tangible results of an increased freedom in intimate relationships. The affirmation of freedom in the sexual sphere was one of the most significant sociological transformations that occurred in the 20th century. This chapter shows how this freedom led to a transformation in the emotional transactions between heterosexual couples, and most conspicuously in the phenomenon known popularly as commitment phobia. As said in Chapter 2, the exercise of freedom occurs always in a social context, and it is this context we need to investigate in order to understand the aporious freedom has generated in the realm of intimate relationships. Sexual romantic freedom is not an abstract practice, but rather is institutionalized and embedded in a contested but still powerful patriarchy. Women perceive, experience, and monitor their sexual freedom in different ways in competitive sexual arenas. This has led to new kinds of suffering in the form of disparities, from female reserve to male detachment. By contemporary standards, 18th and 19th century courtship constrained the sexual behavior of women and to a lesser degree men. During the Christian centuries, although sexual abstinence was imposed on men and women were taught to have greater sexual appetites. Middle and upper middle class women were more likely than men to be reserved in expressing their romantic emotions and sexual longing. The belief emerged that the woman could naturally resist sexual temptation. Abstinence began to be a test and a mark of their virtue. The practice of abstinence for men allowed them to show masculinity in their capacity to desire and win over that woman was supposed to refuse. This was illustrated by Samuel Richardson's novel entitled Pamela. Ito ay kwento ng isang dalagang agresibong nililigawan ng kanyang amo na halos umabot na sa punto na ito ay gahasain. Paulit-ulit niyang nilalabanan ang kanyang mga pang-uusig dito. Ngunit siya ay nagsimulang magkaroon ng pagmamahal dito. Sa huli ay iginalang ng lalaki ang kanyang mga pagtutol at hiniling niya itong pakasalan at malugod naman itong tinanggap ng dalaga. This novel signaled as a new way of conceiving woman's nature and of splitting male and female gender identities around practice of abstinence. Para sa mga kababaihan, ang pag-iwas ay simula ng kanilang pagsubok na nagmamarka ng kanilang kabutihan na tumutulong sa pagtatag ng isang reputasyon sa pag-aasawa. Para naman sa mga kalalakihan, ito ay nagbibigay sa kanila ng pagkakataon na ipakita ang kanilang pagkalalaki sa kanilang kakayahang maghangad at manalo sa kung ano o alin ang dapat tanggihan ng babae. This equation of womanly abstinence with virtue became prominent in American culture. The image and ideal of abstinence, part of a general economy of appropriateness and self-control, served to assign a woman with a higher moral and social status. By elevating sexual control highest among human virtues, the middle-class moralists made female chastity the archetype for human morality. According to Nancy Cott, the clergy's raising of women to the highest moral status removed their sexuality. Ang ganitong bagong kaisipan o ideolohiya ay nakatutulong sa mga kababaihan dahil sa saang sexual na abstinence at kalinisan o purity ay nagsisilbing kandipala para sa moral na pagkakapantay-pantay para sa kanilang kakayahan at respeto sa sarili. Kat shows that in the 19th century, women's sexual freedom had been exploited by men and that the imposition of abstinence endowed them with more power and more equality. The foundation of the argument for women's moral superiority, which was used to elevate women's standing and increase their chances, was the notion that women lack carnal motivation. Sexual reticence gave women a reason to refuse a suitor but did not allow them to pursue one, which meant that men had to be more active and were more exposed during courtship. As we saw in the chapter 2, the historian Ellen Rothman suggests that it was too risky for a woman to express her feelings before a marriage offer. A woman would wait to be sure that her feelings were reciprocated before admitting them even to herself. Kailangan niyang maghintay upang matiyak na ang kanyang nararamdaman ay masusuklian bago ito umamin. Sinasabi rin dito na kailangang hindi manguna ang babae sa pagpapakita ng kanyang nararamdaman, kaya kailangan niya munang maghintay ng isang katibayan ng intensyon at pagmamahal ng lalaki, at ang pag-alok ng pagpapakasal ay isa sa mahalagang katibayan na ito. Ngunit hindi rin naman niya matitiyak kung tatanggapin ang kaniyang alok. In 19th century also, the man's affections, his capacity to show and prove love, were of paramount importance in the decision to marry. When a man proposed marriage, love was his most important qualification. When a woman responded, love was his first consideration. 19th century middle-class masculinity was defined in terms of the capacity to feel and express strong feelings, make and keep promises, and to commit to another with determination and resolution. Men had the same control over their emotions than women. Ang pagiging matatag ay may dedikasyon at maaasahan ay sinasabing ang mga tunay na katangian ng isang lalaki. Karen Listra, another specialist of 19th century courtship practices, confirms that middle to upper middle class men were allowed to a range of expression that paralleled, if did not precisely duplicate, women's. Male commitment was embedded in a moral and economic ecology based around the dowry. Hindi ito nangangahulugan na ang mga lalaki ay hindi na nagtataksil at iniiwan ang kanilang asawa at nagkakaroon ng ibang karelasyon. But such behavior was perceived as deviant and dishonorable in the context of the classes, at least in the Protestant Western Europe and the US. The definition of masculinity differs significantly from the ways that men and their commitment to women are depicted in the early 21st century. In the 21st century, stable, intimate relationships are difficult to achieve, especially for women, because men are emotionally elusive and routinely resist women's attempts to commit to a long-term relationship. That a woman's desire to commit to a man is as self-evident as is the male's resistance to it. Statistics in US. The duration of marriage has decreased. The men who married in 1955, 76% remained in the marriage for at least 20 years, while only 58% of men who married in 1975 remained married for the same length of time. The percentage of men reaching shorter anniversaries as short as 5, 10, or 15 years fell in this period as well. The percentage of men and women who remain unmarried has also increased. In fact, since the 1970s, the number of single-person households has risen hugely, particularly in US but also in Europe. This is due to the later age on marriage and greatly increased divorce rates. In these major trends in marriage in the US since the beginning of the 1980s, it includes an increase in the average age of marriage, 27 years for men and 25 years for women in 2003. That is, people are deferring the decision to marry. New categories have appeared too, such as LAT or living apart together, which refers to patterns of social intimate relations between couples who do not live together because they are unwilling or unable for various reasons to commit to sharing an abode. There is also the popularity and the even relative legitimacy of non-monogamous behavior such as hooking up or polyamory. These data indicate that traditional patterns of commitment have undergone a profound transformation as marriage is less readily chosen as a life option than in the past, and as relationships are organized under the aegis of greater flexibility, short-term contractualism, greater capacity to bail out of them, and a priori total lack of commitment. Although commitment phobia seems to apply to both men and women, it appears to be chronologically and culturally a male prerogative. So how can we explain this? Taken at a face value, the idea of male commitment phobia contradicts a number of the findings in the literature. For example, research shows that men benefit more from marriage than women do. Given that, in most marriage, women tend to serve the man, this is hardly surprising. Moreover, women not only serve their husbands, they encourage their kin-keeping, that is, they keep intact men's relationships to their children and to other family members. Finally, marriage provides the incentive for men to earn more and remain healthy. In early 21st century, Gail Kaufman and Frances find that while 37% of men felt that a man could have a full and satisfying life without being married, the proportion was 59% for women. In other words, at least on the level of perception, men are more likely than women to view marriage as attractive option and to see the state of not being married as significantly less attractive. Women, by contrast, are more likely to perceive an unmarried life as attractive and full. One of the dominant explanations for declining rates of marriage is proposed by the economist Gary Becker, who argues that marriage is based on a trading off of mutual advantages, and that the higher rates of employment among women should make marriage a less desirable option for them, a fact that also explains the decline in the number of marriage. In this view, women will be more choosy and will be able more easily to reject offers from men and perceive to be inadequate in the hope of finding someone better. In other words, a stable marriage market is connected to women being more dependent on marriage for their economic survival. In this view, it is women, not men, who are responsible for the declining rates of marriage and who should be the ones displaying the pattern of commitment phobia. More psychoanalytic explanations suggest that commitment phobia is the result of the masculine gender identity being built against the feminine. Masculine identity is born in the renunciation of the feminine, not in the direct affirmation of the masculine, which leaves masculine gender identity tenuous and fragile. In this view, inspired by psychodynamic models of the male psyche as in the need to separate from the mother, male gender identity forged itself in opposition to female, and to the need for dependence and sharing, making the man less able to create or desire a long-lasting bond. From the 18th to the mid-19th century, sentiment was as much the prerogative of males as females. After the mid-19th century, it became a mainly female prerogative. In the early 21st century, women took over responsibility for caring, for feeling and expressing emotions geared toward the creation of and maintenance of close relationships. Nancy Chodorow famously and brilliantly argued that men's and women's different emotional makeups are the result of a structure of modern nuclear American family, na kung saan ang mga babae ay siya ng may responsibilidad sa pag-aalaga ng mga anak, with the result that girls grow up with no break in identification with their mothers and strive throughout their adult lives to reproduce fusional relationships with others, while boys develop with a sharp sense of separateness and strive for autonomy. Boys learn to separate, girls learn to bond. Masculinity and the demise of commitment. The historian John Tosh claims that in Western societies, masculinity occurs in the three arenas: home, work, and all male associations. Authority in the household, the capacity to earn a wage in a non-servile independent way, and the capacity to form meaningful bonds in voluntary associations, taverns, and clubs that effectively excluded women are traditionally the three pillars of masculinity. Independence, authority in the household, and male solidarity have all been undermined, with traditional masculinity even becoming an inverse signal of status. Culturally coded working class masculinity, it is precisely in the context that sexuality has become one of the most significant status markers of masculinity. Sexuality confers status. Sex appeal and sexuality have become attributes of gender identity and of what within that identity takes the form of status. To an extent, sexuality has always been associated with masculinity, but in many societies, male social power is conditioned for obtaining access to women. Men affirm their social power over women and over other men by exercising sexual domination over numerous women. That is, if sexuality is a field of struggle, then in traditional societies, powerful men are clearly those who dominate it, because male power is so usually translated into greater sexual access to a wider variety of women. Para sa mga lalaki, ang sexualidad ay marka ng kanilang estado o katayuan sa mga tuntunin ng kapasidad na makipagkumpetensya sa ibang mga lalaki sa pagkuha ng atensyon ng babae. Sexual freedom made sexuality a site for the exercise and display of masculinity for men whose status in the three arenas of work, home, and male sociability had been eroded. It transformed sexuality in status. If sex for women was a way to display their status and to bond with other men, the demise of men's control over the household and of their autonomy in the workplace resulted in a sexuality that was hypertrophied, in that it emerged and expressed at once the three aspects of masculinity as status, authority, autonomy, and solidarity. The central role of sexuality in this redefinition of masculinity was greatly facilitated and accelerated by the intense sexualization of women and men throughout the 20th century. That is, by the fact that sexual relationships were no longer regulated by moral frameworks, and by the fact that sexual attractiveness, sexiness, had become an explicit attribute of gender identity, detached from the moral performance of the self. The dynamic of women's exclusivist strategies. Undoubtedly, women's greater readiness to commit is a direct outcome of what we may call their exclusivist pairing strategy. One reason for this strategy is suggested by Susan Brown Miller is that women are exclusivist as part of a contract between men and women in which the man protects the woman from the rape in exchange for her fidelity and dependence. The woman's exclusivist strategy is viewed here as an outcome of woman dependency and gender inequality and unequal power relations. Alice Rossi, on the other hand, suggests that women have a dual innate sexual orientation toward men and toward their young, which explains their exclusivist strategy. Exclusivist sexuality is more likely to be found among women who want motherhood in the institutional framework of monogamous domesticity. These women actually subsume their search for a mate under the construction and perception of their reproductive role. In traditional pre-modern patriarchy, men as much as women are normatively and culturally compelled to have children in order to have households to command and names to propagate. Traditional patriarchal masculinity needs a family to assert itself because it needs to rule over children, women, servants, and land. The main cultural imperative that shapes masculinity is that of psychological autonomy, upward mobility, and economic success in economic organizations. It is thus women who now take on the sociological roles of having and wanting children. In that process, the ecology and architecture of the choice within which they operate have changed considerably. In particular, biological time now plays a significant role in shaping women's cultural perceptions of their bodies and their pairing strategies. Women who choose to have children and marriage or heterosexual domesticity as the framework within which to raise these children are constrained by a perception of their body as a biological unit organized in and by time. Two main factors are responsible for this perception. There is a considerable amount of evidence to suggest that the entry to the labor market and higher education are causing women to postpone both marriage and childbearing, while less educated women are postponing marriage but not childbearing. While until the 19th century an older woman, a woman in her late 20s, might have been desirable based on her accumulation of property or money, modern criteria of sexiness, because they are associated with youth and appearance, make women highly conscious of the process of aging and thus accentuate the organization of femininity within the cultural category of time. In pre-modern Europe, in 25% of marriage, the man was younger than woman. However, between 1970s and the 1990s, Men odds of marrying younger women increased, while women's odds of marrying younger men decreased. This is because men are now more directly dependent on the market for economic survival and can rely only on themselves to survive economically, thus making them less dependent on women's accumulated property and wealth. Hedonic commitment phobia. From cultural standpoint, there are two ways of experiencing commitment phobia, as hedonic and as abolic. In hedonic commitment phobia, commitment is deferred by engaging in a pleasurable accumulation of relationships. It includes a series of relationships and an inability to fixate on one partner. It is characterized as overflowing with desire and difficulty to settle on one object from an abundance of choice. One example of the sheer effect of abundance of sexual choice can be found in the essay by Margaret Fields, selected as the winner of the New York Times Modern Love College contest. As Fields explains about one of her male friends, a fellow college student. Stephen explained that it's not a question of faithfulness to his girlfriend, but of exception. He can't be expected not to want to sleep with other people, so he can't expect her to think differently. They are both young and living in New York, and as everyone in New York knows, there is the possibility of meeting anyone, everywhere, all the time. In this quote, clearly the difficulty to settle on one object is due to the abundance of choice and to the permanent sense of possibilities. This quotation makes it apparent that there are many options available and there is a constant sense of possibility, which makes the difficulty to settle on one object. Abundance is a psychological and economic consequence of hierarchical and competitive sexual environments that exchange the nature of desire, activating it through the principle of scarcity. This in turn is supposed to reflect value and position in the sexual environment. Thus, sexual abundance consequently influences both desire and the urge to desire. Abolic commitment phobia. Abulia can describe as a more advanced stage of culture of abundance, in which the capacity to want and to desire unravels. Those unable to desire a relationship, deficient in desire, the problem of not wanting anyone. There are three main ideas of abolic commitment of phobia. The first is struggling to feel emotions. Those are unable to desire relationships. They are struggling on developing emotions and thus preferences for an object. Also, they are struggling on settling on one person. Secondly, diminished senses of self, a self that doubts itself and has no demonstrable inner resources to actually desire what it wants. And lastly, difficulty of projecting themselves into the future. That is the oppressive character of promising. The new architecture of romantic choice or the disorganization of the will. In pre-modern marriage markets, choice was shaped by the close interaction of the self with family and the work environment. And perhaps because of that, it was binding. Modern marriage markets, in contrast, seem to operate through the seemingly unconstrained, free, and unfettered encounters between people whose faculty of choice is not only exercised, but ongoingly in demand. Yet the faculty of choice, far from being based on pure emotionality, actually entails a complex, affective, and cognitive apparatus to evaluate partners, to consult oneself about one's emotions toward them, and to predict one's capacity to sustain these emotions. Modern intimacy and pairing are not acts only of pure volition. They are also the outcome of choice based on complex sets of evaluations. However, modern choice differs considerably in being characterized by three elements whose combination makes it properly contemporary. It is exercised usually through a large number of options, real or imagined, or real and imagined. It is the outcome of process of introspection in which needs, emotions, and the lifestyle preferences are all weighed, and it emanates from individualized will and emotionality, engaged and responding to another's pure will and emotionality, which in principle need to be constantly renewed. That is because a love choice is never entirely binding. It must be renewed through the ongoing and constant production of sentiments. The sheer increase in an abundance of real and imagined sexual partners are the major cause of transformation in the ecology of choice. This transformation has emerged as the result of the collapse of religious, ethnic, racial, and class rules of endogamy, which in principle allows anyone to access the marriage market. Promise keeping and the architecture of modern choice. Commitment and keeping promises have become problematic aspects of personhood. Here, romantic nature has changed due to sexual and emotional disconnect. Amartya Sen said that commitment is defined by the fact that it derives a wedge between personal choice and personal welfare. In other words, to commit oneself means to make a choice in which one forgoes the possibility that one may increase one's welfare. Commitment requires a certain ability to look ahead, the ability to put a stop to the process of looking for and making decisions by foregoing the chance of better opportunities. When a decision feels like the best option available, or when a decision is accepted as good enough, that is when commitment happens. Thus, love and commitment are in some ways inextricably linked, at least subjectively. Sexual abundance and emotional inequalities. Emotional inequalities occur through the transformation of the romantic will, how a person loves and chooses to bind his or her life to that of another, itself the outcome of transformation of the ecology and architecture of choice. Here, sex is happening more casually, allowing for less emotional detachment. Men express their sexuality to show masculinity, and serial sexuality leads to emotional detachment.